Senior officials from the U.S. and Russia met in Saudi Arabia to start talks on possibly ending the long war in Ukraine. The two sides agreed to restore embassy staffing and will appoint teams focused on negotiating an end to the war. Now, both sides claim a feeling of progress on ending the conflict. But what about Ukraine and the rest of Europe being involved in the conversation? Joining me now to discuss this, Congressman Warren Davidson. He is a member of both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Financial Services Committee. He serves Ohio's 8th Congressional District. Congressman Davidson, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to see you.
It's always an honor. Thank you, Tony.
All right. So Warren, let me ask you this. You've got the Ukrainian president saying, hey, we can't agree to anything that we're not a part of. Is this just the first phase? Do you think we're going to see Ukraine and other European leaders engaged in this conversation?
Yeah, I think the United States and Russia will work out the framework, and that's, a long time, really post-Cold War, through the entire Cold War. A lot of the top-level negotiations were U.S., Russia, U.S., Soviet Union negotiations. And I think President Trump believes he can deal with the main combatant. I mean, remember, there was a state of peace before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. So the real bad actor here is Russia. And, I could understand why Zelensky would say, well, I'm not going to commit to be bound by whatever, these two parties do. I'm going to represent my own country. But I think he also recognizes the context in which it occurs is the pipeline of as much as it takes, as long as it takes, is cut off.
Right. I mean, I do think America has a larger share of the conversation here because without the United States funding and armaments, Ukraine wouldn't still be in this war.
Right. I mean, and Zelensky certainly knows that. I mean, the Europeans might lament it and they want the United States to do whatever. And I think it's brilliant how Donald Trump has positioned it in the last few weeks to say, we're looking at a framework where European forces occupy Ukraine to keep the peace. And they're all quickly going, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about European obligations. They want the United States to keep running things with the open checkbook. And I think J.D. Vance delivered a great message to say, yeah, the idea that we're just going to keep pouring cash into things without saying, what exactly are we defending, are over.
Right. And I think that's the appropriate position to take. I do want to ask you this, Congressman Davidson. When you look at, this has been going on. The United States has funded it. We've enabled Ukraine to defend itself against the aggressor, which was Russia. What is a likely outcome here when we talk about borders?
I think a likely outcome, given the situation we're in right now, is Russia will occupy a portion of eastern Ukraine, or what has traditionally been eastern Ukraine. And that area is Russian speaking. So I spoke with some folks who are in America who are from that region, the Donbass area of eastern Ukraine. And they said maybe the best analogy for someone in America is it's kind of like Quebec is in Canada. They want to keep speaking French. They want to recognize the distinctions of their culture. They don't necessarily want to be part of France. But if somehow the English-speaking part of Canada was going to do some purge and say, no, you have to give up all of your French language, all your customs, give up where you worship and how you worship, well, you'd be a little more receptive to the relationship with France. And that's kind of where a lot of the Russian-speaking portion of Ukraine is. But unfortunately, that's where a lot of the fighting has occurred. So a lot of it's been effectively depopulated from the regular civilian population right now. So it is a war-torn area, and the casualties have been bad on both sides. And I think Donald Trump's been clear. He just wants people to stop dying. He wants to restore a state of peace.
Of course, Russia has on the table that no NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine cannot join NATO. Are we given, obviously the negotiations are just beginning, but I would think we do not want to concede those things which would encourage this type of aggressive behavior that Russia took in invading Ukraine and, as you pointed out, cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars.
Yeah, hundreds of billions of dollars and probably hundreds of thousands of lives. And it's horrific what's gone on there. But I think if you go back at the end of the Cold War, the United States had initially committed to no eastern expansion of NATO, and obviously it's expanded massively. And as the Europeans have become accustomed to, it's the de facto European defense force. All the major economies in Europe are underfunding their defense obligation. I mean, kudos to the Baltic republics like Latvia and Estonia, places like Poland that are really going above and beyond to defend their own countries. But you have your big economies like France, like Germany, like Italy that aren't really meeting their obligations, and so that really accounts for a lot of the manpower and the resources that come out of Europe. So the idea that the United States is just going to keep footing the bill and frankly let the Europeans drive the agenda, I think has to go away, and that's definitely what was going on when Jens Stoltenberg, who was the previous Secretary General for NATO. I mean, he really kind of drove that agenda, and Anthony Blinken seemed very content to just follow Stoltenberg's lead. I don't think that's going to happen with Secretary Rubio or with Mike Waltz, our national security advisor.
Warren, are we obligated under agreements to protect Ukraine from Russia aggression?
I don't think there's a formal obligation. I think people do recognize there's a sort of moral obligation there because the United States participated in the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and certainly European allies that were concerned about nuclear weapons being left in Ukraine at the end of the Cold War. So in 1994, Ukraine gave those weapons really back to Russia, which frankly, the Soviet Union, their headquarters was in Moscow. At that point, there wasn't really a meaningful distinction between what was Ukraine and what was Russia. But clearly the Soviet Empire built those nuclear weapons, and so in a sense they gave them back. And that was really what happened in 2014. So go back to 2014, the Russian Navy, which was before the Soviet Navy, their main warm water port was in the southern portion there of Ukraine and Crimea. And so the idea that Russia is going to give that back, I think they basically said, no, we're going to keep operating our port. And that came to a head really in 2013 when the Ukrainian people decided they were going to do a trade deal with Russia instead of do a trade deal with the European Union and work towards EU membership. So, this is a long-standing conflict. There's been conflict with Russia and Ukraine through lots of history. Mostly it's been peaceful, but there have been periods of real conflict between the two countries. And, sadly, we're in that phase again right now.
So obviously these conversations are just beginning, but hopefully they will lead to a resolution of that conflict. And then looking back, when you look at, as you pointed out, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent, the tens of thousands of lives that have been lost, you have to, what was gained, and was this fueled by American involvement?
Well, I think a lot of the conflict there has been fueled by American involvement. And, thankfully, in my opinion, Victoria Nuland is retired. She was one of the main agitators when she was at the State Department and, really kind of fueled this whole end of 2013 transition into 2014 regime change with a sort of a soft coup inside Ukraine. And, I won't say that the United States is the only entity responsible or that we even directly played a role in that, but I do know Victoria Nuland was very happy about it. And, this has been, a tipping point from the time Russia's been very clear that they don't want NATO to expand eastward, but the real hard thing for them was when NATO was going to expand into Ukraine. And go back, the United States had a date certain withdrawal from Afghanistan of August 31st, 2021. And on September 1st of 2021, the very next day, the Biden administration entered into a partnership agreement with Ukraine to support their membership, not just in the European Union, but in NATO. So that's when you saw Putin start to move his forces more aggressively to the Ukrainian border. And then 2 days before Putin actually invaded, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, gave a speech talking about how important it was for NATO to project power eastward across Asia. And that clearly referring not just to Russia, but to China and trying to grow NATO into South Korea and Japan. So this is really something that has been pushed and agitated. None of that excuses what Putin did,
Right.
but we certainly have played a role.
In a little bit of incitement there.
Absolutely.
Congressman Warren Davidson, always great to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us today. Very insightful.
Likewise. Thank you, Tony. God bless you and all your viewers.